Here's some exclusive video we obtained of the president at a fundraiser just over the weekend.
Institutions matter. And this president, what he did on January the 6th, here he's saying now, he said if he doesn't win, there'll be a bloodbath. It's outrageous what he's talking about.
It's outrageous what he's talking about. Hard to argue with that. Starting us off tonight is Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California. Congressman, it's great to see you, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about this because you know so much as somebody who was on the select committee that investigated January 6th about these events, what led up to them. And we've talked a lot about this before, but I kind of just went through some of the language that Trump, Lara Trump, Steve Bannon, and others have been using in recent days and weeks. And it seems to me like they're laying the groundwork for another effort. But I want to know what you hear from it. Is it something different from what led up to 2020, or is it similar in your view?
It's similar, and it's even worse, particularly when you hear Steve Bannon basically saying, you know, fight or die, because Trump is doing what he did prior to the last election, which is laying the seeds that if he loses, that he will challenge it as illegitimate, that there's no way he can lose. And, you know, look, the thing that Donald Trump fears more than anything else is being labeled a loser. He's probably even more willing to be called a felon than he is a loser. But he's a loser, and he's desperately afraid that he may lose again. And if he does lose again, he wants to challenge the results. And so he is laying the foundation. But we saw with even less incendiary rhetoric 4 years ago that it led to a violent confrontation, a mob descending on the Capitol. Now that they are just escalating the rhetoric, probably with even greater fears of losing. And, you know, added to this for Trump, I think he feels if he doesn't win, he's going to jail. And so he has all the more reason to contest any losing result. But it is more the same, but even more dangerous.
You know, one of the things we talk about a lot here on the show is just how much we should be concerned about something, because we're not trying to scare people. His rhetoric is certainly scary, but he has tried to whip up his supporters to show up around his court appearances. He hasn't been successful. At the same time, again, this language is scary. How should you, as you're talking to your neighbors, as you're campaigning across California, what are you telling people about the level of concern they should have?
Well, I'm encouraged by the fact that, as you say, he encouraged people to rise up if he were prosecuted. They didn't rise up. There wasn't this massive protest. He was convicted. It caused barely a stir, I think, among his most rabid base in terms of any public protest. But at the same time, you can't discount the chance that if he loses again, when he loses again, that he will go to even greater lengths to try to overturn the results. And what I do tell people is the worst case scenario is that the result is close. That instead of a broad victory like we saw by Joe Biden 4 years ago, where he won in numerous battleground states by pretty good margins, let's say it comes down to a single state. And there I really do worry. And there is simply no institution we can rely on. I would not want to rely on the Supreme Court in another close presidential contest any more than we saw in Bush v. Gore. And because there's such little confidence in the court, that would be, I think, a different kind of catastrophe. But the only remedy really is the one in all of our hands, and that is to make sure that Joe Biden wins overwhelmingly, that this is not close. That is the best way to avoid, I think, any kind of instability post-election.
You know, Congressman, one of the challenges that you've warned about and others have warned about from the committee is just the role of enablers. And Trump and Mike Johnson met today in Mar-a-Lago. It was also reported in the last few days that Trump called Mike Johnson to ask him for his help in overturning the conviction. That's not a role, as far as I understand the rules of the House, that the House could play, even a Speaker of the House. But are there tactics, or what could he use if he wanted to, Mike Johnson, to run interference here or try to have an impact on a conviction that was done in a state court?
Well, they are really already trying to do that. Mike Johnson has been trying to do that for some time, acting through the Judiciary Committee, where the committee that I serve on under Jim Jordan has been subpoenaing witnesses from the Manhattan DA's office and subpoenaing documents and trying to attack Alvin Bragg, holding field hearings in Manhattan, as our committee did, with the idea of somehow trying to embarrass Alvin Bragg. None of it has been successful, but it is a clear effort by Johnson through Judiciary Committee, through the Oversight Committee, to do Trump's bidding and try to discredit this prosecution. There's no way we can overturn it. There are ways that, we can further cause mischief, which I think the speaker's trying to do. And, you look at Trump's continuing influence on, for example, telling Johnson who to put on the Intelligence Committee, puts, two of his firebrands on that committee. That's a real national security problem and threat. So he's already doing enough of the president's bidding, the former president's bidding, to be of grave concern.
I was interested in your view on that because, it's been reported, and this I don't think will surprise you as the former chairman of the Intelligence Committee, that not just Democrats but Republicans who are a part of that committee are upset about the naming of Congressman Scott Perry and Ronnie Jackson, who were the people you were referencing. Talk to me a little bit about the impact and the risk of having people like that on the committee who were named reportedly by the Speaker of the House, and then even the chairman of the committee wasn't given a heads up on it.
It is amazing that, down to the micromanaging of who Johnson puts on committees, Trump is still calling the shots. But putting someone like Scott Perry on the committee, someone whose own cell phone records were subpoenaed by the Justice Department, someone who was involved in trying to install Jeffrey Clark, this totally unqualified person at the Justice Department in the environmental section, to install him as Trump's attorney general because he thought he would be more useful in overturning the results of the election. Someone like that on the committee who's, involved already in an ongoing investigation. What it will mean is the intelligence agencies are simply not going to share the kind of information with the committee as a whole because they can't trust him. And so it undermines the oversight role of the committee if the agencies aren't comfortable sharing with you. Sadly, though, he will have access to a lot of highly classified written material, and there's not much that can be done about that. So I'm not surprised that even some of the Republican members are unhappy with these choices. I have to thank both the chair and ranking member of the Intelligence Committee are both unhappy about this. And again, it shows the weakness of Speaker Johnson and the continued dominance of Donald Trump.
So it's one thing to hear a campaign talk about the contrast between the two candidates in this presidential election, and it is another thing to actually see it with your own eyes. Take a look at this new ad out today from the Biden campaign.
In the courtroom, we see Donald Trump for who he is. He's been convicted of 34 felonies, found liable for sexual assault, and he committed financial fraud. Meanwhile, Joe Biden's been working, lowering health care costs and making big corporations pay their fair share. This election is between a convicted criminal who's only out for himself and a president who's fighting for your family.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
A courtroom versus the Oval Office, posing for a mugshot versus shaking hands with voters, fighting for himself versus fighting for you. And that's a key line. I think it's a key part of the message. A convicted criminal versus a president. That is the contrast there in that ad. That is the choice. And just over a week from the first debate, the Biden campaign is betting big that aggressively calling that out now will help them shake up this race in the debate. This new ad is part of a $50 million ad buy. It will air across all battleground states starting today. But will we hear more along these lines from the president himself? And will any of it resonate with the audience who really matters, the voters? We will see. But here to talk to me about it is Quentin Folks, the Biden campaign's principal deputy campaign manager. And he joins me now. Quentin, I know you've got a lot on your plate. Thank you for taking the time. This is a very forceful ad, which is why we want to play it. It's part of a very significant ad buy. So first, let me just start by asking you, who knows more about the swing states and where things work than you, because that's what you oversee. Where are these states? Which states is this going to play in of those swing states? And can you tell us more about what percentage of that $50 million is going to be towards that ad buy, that ad?
Look, we're talking to voters in a number of states. It's the typical states: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Florida. Look, we have to get the message out, and the message is very clear. This election is about somebody who wakes up every single day fighting for the American people, and Donald Trump, who is only in this campaign fighting for himself. He's a convicted felon, as you all just heard in the ad, and he will do anything to hold on to power so that he can continue to run a campaign on revenge and retribution. And we have to make sure that the American voters know that Donald Trump isn't thinking about him, and meanwhile, thinking about them. And meanwhile, President Biden is waking up every single day fighting to lower costs, making corporations pay their fair share, and that is what this election is about.
And that was the core message of the ad, which was a very powerful ad, had the voice of a narrator, which I think was probably a strategic choice. The first presidential debate is just 10 days away. Is the ad a preview? I mean, that tone, that contrast, how the contrast is done of what we should all expect to hear from President Biden on the stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Look, I think President Biden is going to make sure that Donald Trump has to answer for his extreme agenda, answer for why he continues to double down to try to rip away freedoms from the American people, including millions of women across this country who have less freedoms than their ancestors because of Donald Trump and what he has done to this country, and why he continues to throw the middle class under the bus at the expense of wealthy corporations and his wealthy friends. That is what President Biden is going to get on stage and hold Donald Trump accountable for.
I also want to ask you about a statement the Biden campaign put out following comments from a former Trump aide who confirmed that Trump talked about executing Americans. This was a fiery statement. I mean, the statement called out Trump's thirst for violence and said he is completely snapped. And you can't make this stuff up. A lot to respond to. But I was curious because I think a lot of people, Democrats out there, people who are rooting for Biden, cheer for that and think, wow, this is fiery. We want to see this sort of fiery language, this fiery message. Is this kind of the type of language and tone that people should expect from campaign spokespeople and the campaign moving forward?
Look, we're going to continue to make sure that we're calling attention to it. And, you know, some of our statements are a little bit more spicy, but it's what it necessitates. I mean, this is a pattern and an agenda. And that's the whole thing. It's not the fact that Donald Trump is a convicted felon. It's the fact of why he is a convicted felon. He is literally willing to go to whatever lengths possible to hold on to power so that he can continue to try to get his way and run a campaign on revenge and retribution. And we have to make sure that we are calling that out. And so, you know, if at times it necessitates a spicy statement, that is what we're going to do. But at the end of the day, the message is very clear. The contrast in this election is clear. Donald Trump is only in this for himself, and he is doubling down. He is willing to do whatever it takes, including break the law, in order to get what he wants. And we're going to do everything we can to stop it.
He's going to keep giving you stuff to be spicy with, I suspect. So keep being spicy. Before I let you go, I wanted to get your reaction to something Trump told Semaphore in an interview. He was asked how he responds to black voters who call him racist. And this is what he said. And this is a direct quote. I have so many black friends that if I were a racist, they wouldn't be friends. They would know better than anybody and fast. I mean, I don't know what else to ask you other than your reaction to that statement and what his assessment is of his level of racism, I guess.
I mean, that statement sounds like something a racist would say. I would laugh if the stakes of this election weren't so high, but they are incredibly high. And unfortunately, it's nothing to laugh at. I mean, look at what Donald Trump has done. He has doubled down, calling for the execution of the exonerated five before entering politics, refusing to rent his apartment buildings to African Americans. And then worse, while he was president, leaving more African Americans uninsured, unemployed. That is the only thing that Donald Trump thinks about when it comes to Black America. And so, again, that statement sounds exactly like somebody who is racist would say to try to prove that they're not. And so, but the proof is in the pudding, and we're going to continue to make sure that Black America knows that Donald Trump cares nothing about them, the same that he does not care about the rest of America, and that President Biden is continuing to put in the work to both earn their vote and make their lives better.
Glenn, folks, you got a lot of campaign oversight to be spending your time on. Thank you for spending some time with me tonight. I really appreciate it. With less than 5 months to go until Election Day and the polls neck and neck, the threat of a second Trump term looms large. We talk about it a lot on this show. But as the New York Times reports, progressive groups say they have learned their lesson from 2016, or learned a lot of lessons, I should say, from 2016. They've already started putting plans in place to resist an anti-democratic, authoritarian Trump agenda. Joining me now are the heads of two of those groups. Patrick Gaspard is the president and CEO of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and Anthony Romero is the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union. You both are so busy. I so appreciate you taking the time tonight. I think this is so important for people to hear about and understand. So, Patrick, let me start with you. You talked about how we have to, quote, democracy-proof our institutions. I think that's a great phrase, and values in preparation for a second Trump term. Talk to me about what that looks like. What does it mean to democracy-proof our institutions?
Jen, thanks for having us on, and thanks for being a bulwark for democracy every single night on the air. I think that I understated the level of the threat. Instead of just democracy-proofing, given some of the things that we've heard from Donald Trump and from the very weak Speaker of the House who's willing to go along with his plans, we may need to fireproof our democracy. What does that mean? There are a set of norms that we have taken for granted over decades, over actually centuries of American democratic governance that we now understand are not baked into law, but we need to find ways to harden. Right now, the Biden administration has done a commendable job of lifting up rules in the administration to strengthen the civil service, for instance, because we know that there is an active threat from Project 2025 that's directed at federal workers because they intend to weaponize the agencies and to put their political appointees in to kind of dismantle the architecture of democracy in those agencies. But it also means, Jen, that this time we need greater coordination between federal officials like senators and Congress members and mayors and governors, not just in blue states, but in those purple states as well. We know from recent practice that red state governors have been lifting up all kinds of litigation in like egregious ways against the federal government. But if this threat comes to be, we're going to need governors to step forward and mayors as well to push litigation against actual constitutional threats that we're facing. And then the last thing I'll say, Jen, is that folks like Anthony Romero and I and so many of the other groups that are interviewed in that Times piece need to kind of create a spine for our democracy and a real network, and can't just go after this thing like a whack-a-mole issue after issue, but lift up a broader conversation about democracy with American citizens that leads us to putting up real scaffolding around our norms, our values, and those institutions themselves.
Spine for our democracy. That's a very good phrase, Patrick. I like it. So, Anthony, let me ask you about one of those pieces of litigation. Well, what's clear from this article, which I think all of us know, is the ACLU is working on a lot. And one of the pieces in this article talks about how the ACLU is preparing litigation that would challenge the Insurrection Act, which is something that, frankly, scares people, the potential for that. If Donald Trump tried to send troops into American cities, say. Talk to me a little bit about how, it's a litigation apparatus or effort. How concerned are you about that possibility? And what does that look like, that effort that the ACLU is kind of preparing at this point in time?
So, thank you, Jen. And I'm glad to be here with Patrick and colleagues to talk to you about what we're doing. First, most importantly, we have to move beyond admiring the problem. There's no time for hand-wringing. There's no way. We need to spend much more time than just identifying the threats. We need to lay out a plan for what if the worst threats were to come to pass. And in litigation takes time. You've got to think through the theories, you got to think through the venues, what types of clients, where you would file, what are the best cases to run the gauntlet on. And part of that work we're doing now. And we're mapping out across all these different issue areas, how do we amass the legal theories and the tactics and the strategies, and then the relationships with other organizations, like the Center for American Progress with Patrick and others, about dividing and conquering. And it's going to be way too much for any one organization to handle on its own. The last time around, the ACLU brought 434 legal actions against the Trump administration. We were the David to the government's Goliath, and we were up against everything we had. And yet we will not be prepared, even as much as we prepare now, we won't be ready to beat the full firepower of this government. Donald Trump gets a second term in office, he will have enormous powers. They're going to be much more rigorous. They're going to go for the jugular. He's going to be the redemption that he promises about making sure that he follows through on all of his threats. And so we've got to be ready. And so that's what our lawyers right now are mapping out the cases, the theories. We're publishing them in a series of memos that we have on our website. We've already issued 2, one on immigration, a second one on LGBT rights, literally laying out a game plan for what do we do to fight these abuses if they come to pass.